Adolf Hitler is remembered today as one of the worst dictators in the world. He killed millions of Jews, Slavs, disabled people, and others that he and his notorious Nazi party deemed undesirable. Even speaking Hitler's name today is synonymous with evil. But what if this notorious dictator never rose to power? Would the world be any different? Or would the atrocities of World War II still continue to wreak havoc on the world? First, we must examine if Hitler was a product of his times or created by its times. If Hitler was a product of his times, then his role could have been easily filled by another aggressive, convincing orator. However, if Hitler was responsible largely for the Holocaust and the Second World War, then history itself would be radically shaken. Hitler was the one that changed a minor anti-Semitic, anti-Marxist, and anti-communist German party called the German Workers' Party into the Nazi Party. He designed the swastika symbol of the Nazis and, using his oratorical skills, expanded the power and size of the party. Hitler captivated audience with his speeches that blamed people such as the Jews for the German hardships and problems that they faced after losing the First World War. One member of the Hitler Youth would later say, "We erupted into a frenzy of nationalistic pride that bordered on hysteria." Hitler's speeches captivated audiences, and on November 8th and 9th of 1923, he launched his planned Beer Hall Putsch, in which he attempted to follow Benito Mussolini's example and overthrow the government. He first invaded a beer hall in Munich, Germany, and then his Nazi thugs faced off against the police. In the chaos, 16 Nazis and 4 police officers died, and Hitler retreated to a home of a close friend. Accounts say that he was depressed, and some put him as contemplating suicide. For the purposes of our scenario, let's say that Hitler finally decides to end it all. Instead of committing suicide at the end of World War II, Hitler dies more than 20 years prior. High-ranking members of the Nazi Party are arrested instead, and in our timeline, Alfred Rosenberg takes control as the temporary leader of the party. With the world seeing the party as just another violent group in the chaotic scene in post-war Germany, the party regresses back into obscurity, having briefly held the world scene. In our timeline, the failed putsch actually helped Hitler in the long term. The event made headlines across the world and gave Hitler a chance to state his views publicly in his trial. The prison time gave him time to write the racist Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which outlined Hitler's views on the world. Also, it was after being released from prison after only 9 months that Hitler decided to achieve power through peaceful means and not through violence. Hitler began to build up his party again after being released from jail. And although the Nazis were weakened somewhat by Germany's booming economy in the 1920s, the stock market crash in 1929 provided them with a renewed chance to make a comeback. Without the oratorical skills and strong leadership of Hitler, the Nazis became a small right-wing party among the many German factions by the Great Depression. However, during a time of what seemed like a failure of the democratic Weimar government in place, Germans would look for nationalism and aid from extremist groups. Left-wing groups advocated for labor reforms, new taxation programs, welfare programs, and rights for women. Overall, they were less racist and radical in their messages than right-wingers and less nationalistic. Moderate groups such as Democratic and Catholic Center Party would likely be weakened by the problems that many Germans were facing and the failure of the Republican German government to respond. Other than the Nazi Party, another prominent right-wing party was the German National People's Party, which was actually popular before the rise of the Nazis. In December 1924, the party won more than 20% of the vote and was on its way to becoming a rising power if not for the Nazis. Like the Nazis, they were against the Republican government and wanted more German lands, but it also wanted a restoration of the German monarchy. So, if delusioned German people were to seek refuge in a nationalistic and militaristic message, they would likely flock to the nationalists. The Nazi Party would not have nearly any great orators as Hitler. It could not convey their message of hate to a variety of people. They dissolved in the early 30s as the nationalists continued to amass power. The Nationalist Party platform in 1931 pretty much went like this. Only a strong German nationality that consciously preserves its nature and essence and keeps itself free of foreign influence can provide the foundation for a strong German state. For that reason, we resist the undermining un-German spirit in all forms, whether it stems from Jewish or other circles. We are emphatically opposed to the prevalence of Judaism in the government and public life, which has emerged ever more ominously since the Revolution. The flow of foreigners across our borders is to be prohibited. Even the nationalists were anti-Semitic. Like Hitler, they would blame Jews for their problems, and we could see another Kristallnacht occurring. Anti-Semitism, which was always present, would only get worse if the nationalists were to come to power. Much like in our timeline, Germany basically walks away from the Treaty of Versailles and will build up its navy to March pre-war levels. It stops war reparations, builds up government intervention to counteract the effects of the Depression, and restores the monarchy to the Hohenzollern family. Kaiser Wilhelm II is put back on the throne, albeit in a constitutional monarchy. Wilhelm wouldn't have any actual power, and will be more like a figurehead and national symbol around which Germans can rally around in difficult times. President Paul von Hindenburg, who died in 1934, is replaced by a similar president. In our timeline, the nationalists did support the election of Hindenburg, so it makes sense that a Hindenburg-like figure would take the seat of power. However, unlike Hindenburg, this new president would support the constitutional monarchy. He would support building up German economic and military strength, but not take any actions to invade other nations. The former Allied nations would watch German military strength uneasily, but never declares war, as German leaders would be much more moderate in this new timeline. Sure, there would be mass violence and racism against Jews, and Germans would still seek scapegoats and marginalized people, but a Holocaust-style event never takes place. 1930s will be plagued by chaos and virtual anarchy between opposing factors such as communists and anti-communists, and the president and the chancellor will be forced to declare martial law and gain extra powers, but nothing approaching the position of Führer is ever created. Perhaps if people were tired of the incompetent democratic government, powers would be gradually bestowed upon Kaiser Wilhelm, but learning from his mistakes of World War I, he would never try to engage in another major conflict. He was kind of quick to take action, and being restored to his crown, Wilhelm will exercise more self-restraint. Listening to his advisors, a German New Deal program takes place that revitalizes the economy. In Italy, Benito Mussolini fails to actively fight in Europe, as he does not have a key fascist ally in the form of Hitler in our timeline. Instead, he tries to fight African nations such as Ethiopia in our timeline, or invade colonies of other European powers. Inevitably, his military actions will fail against superior European nations, and he will be ousted, externally or internally. World War II, at least what we think of, never happens. This opens an entire can of worms that can be saved for another video. Japan will still aggressively expand into China and European colonies in East Asia. This will still result in a U.S. embargo to Japan and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The U.S. will fight a smaller-scale war against Japan and defeats it quickly, within 10 months. Without a war in Europe to fight, the U.S. war machine can slowly focus on Japan. It is not nearly as rehabilitated as in our timeline, as there is no large war to fight. The atomic bombs are never dropped, and there is enough time to develop them. Instead, the U.S. has to invade the Japanese homeland and suffers many casualties. The fact that World War II never occurs will radically change the modern world. Also, without the Holocaust, even though Jews are persecuted more than usual, they will never request the creation of a Jewish state in the Middle East to flee. Israel as we know it never exists, and the Palestinians are given full control of the area. So far, we haven't discussed the Soviet Union. In the alternate timeline, Joseph Stalin will still be a power of the nation, and the Soviets will never get the chance to expand into Eastern Europe, as they did in our timeline. In our timeline, after suffering horrendous casualties to the Nazis in World War II, the Soviets occupied Eastern Europe as a buffer against future attacks. Thus, with Eastern Europe free of communist intervention, it is likely that much of the tensions involved between the US and Soviet Union that occurred in our timeline will be reduced.